this is the final video for the AQA English Language Paper 2 exam with a focus on question 4. So again, you're going to need to have the source material in front of you before accessing the rest of this video. So you can either copy and paste this link into your search browser, or you can just type AQA into Google. Either way, you'll need to find yourself the assessment resources page, and when you're on there you can click on paper 2 specimen insert, and that should automatically download for you so that you can read the sources on Eddie and Henry. So question 4 then is worth 16 marks, and therefore we would recommend you to spend about 20 minutes on this question. Just like you did with paper 1, question 4, you will need to take an element of this time to plan, so that you make the writing process a little bit easier for yourself. I would recommend anything up to about 5 minutes worth of planning, which would leave you about 15 minutes worth of actual writing. Okay, so question 4 is going to ask you to compare both writers' different views on a topic and evaluate how they have conveyed that point. Now, just from looking at the wording there seems to be an awful lot of skills within this question, and that is the case with question 4. You're being asked to compare ideas and perspectives essentially, but what you need to think of this question as is kind of like a combination of all of the skills that you've practiced in the paper so far. So for instance, question 1 was drawing explicit and implicit information. You're going to be required to draw implicit, well, hopefully implicit information for this question as well. You're also going to need to synthesize that, to bring that all together, which is the skill that you practiced in question 2. And then finally, you're also going to be you're going to have to do some language analysis, which is of course the skill which you practiced in question 3. So do think of question 4 kind of like the finale. It's where you're bringing everything together to draw on all of the skills that you've practiced so far in this paper. Okay, now if you followed any of the other videos, you should know a bit about the TAP process, and hopefully you'll already have done the TAP process during your reading time. But just in case you haven't, by the time you get to question 4, TAP and understanding the TAP of a source is going to be really useful, so make sure that you have done that process before you begin to answer it. Okay, the most important things to remember for question 4 are on the current slide. So when thinking about the sources, in order to be able to comment on what the viewpoint is, well, you firstly have to be able to establish for yourself exactly what that writer's viewpoint is on the topic. Then when you've done that, you then need to be able to consider, okay, well, how has the writer put across that viewpoint on the topic? How is it that they have conveyed to me that is what they think about the given topic? And of course the topic will be decided by the question, which we're going to have a look at in just a second. So when you're thinking about how the writer conveys their ideas, things that you need to consider are the following. How have they used language to achieve this? And hopefully you'll remember from question 3 that language can entail words and phrases, sentence forms, and also language techniques. You might also want to consider how the writer might have structured their piece of writing in order to achieve this. So again, you could even think back to paper 1 if you wanted to, question 3, and consider some of the structural features that we were looking at and apply them to the non-fiction source. The final thing is how does the tone of the writing reflect this? And tone's a useful tool anyway, but particularly for question 4. If you just need a little reminder of what tone is, it literally just means the mood or the attitude of the writing. So you can definitely consider how the tone has been used to help you try to figure out the viewpoint. So the next couple of slides are just going to be taking this idea, this basic principle for answering question 4 successfully, a little bit further and exploring some of the things that you might want to pick up on within these areas. So, as we said before, one of the most important things that you need to do, seeing as you're being asked on it, is to decide what is the writer's viewpoint on the topic that you've been given. But you can consider whether that viewpoint appears to shift at all. Is it consistent all the way through, or does that viewpoint sort of change, or does that viewpoint develop? You might consider whether it's a biased viewpoint, whether it's quite neutral, or whether it's objective. One of the reasons that it's so important to establish the TAP is that actually you can consider whether the perspective or the viewpoint's been affected by the text audience or the purpose. So, for instance, you could ask yourself, does the era of the writing and where it was published, does that tell you anything about the viewpoint or the intentions of the writer, or perhaps even maybe what type of audience it was aimed at? So TAP can also be useful for helping you tap into the perspective and viewpoint of the writer. Okay, then coming back to tone, as we just discussed before, when you're reading the source, you should get a general sense of the mood and the atmosphere of the writing. You can ask yourself, okay, have we got a neutral tone here? Have we got an angry tone, a mocking tone, perhaps a touch of sarcasm in there? You can decide whether the tone is formal or informal. Is the tone personal or impersonal? And then again, whether that tone shifts at all. It doesn't have to remain consistent all the way through, and it's always good to note if there are any changes. Closely linked to tone, you might consider how the writer addresses the reader. So and it does very much link with tone. You're sort of looking at what kind of style they've gone for, really. So does the writer use assertive statements or questions or commands? Do they use pronouns or direct address? Do they address the reader in a friendly way, or is it a bit passive, or are they kind of accusing the reader? Generally, consider, okay, well, what sort of style and what feeling have they gone for here? What sort of relationship are they trying to establish with their reader? Then you can look at how the writing is structured. So basically what this means is some of the features that perhaps you'll be familiar with from question 3 in paper 1. You can consider the narrative voice. First person is naturally going to be a little bit more personal than perhaps an objective third person. You might consider how the structure changes and develops. And from that, how do the changes in the structure emphasise the viewpoint? And then finally, what methods does the writer use to convey that viewpoint? So this is where we're considering language structure and tone. So language features in this sense, emotive language perhaps. Have they used some interviews? Have they quoted from a reliable source? Have they used any statistics? And of course, those language techniques are going to depend on the type of source that you've got in front of you. If it's more persuasive, you're probably going to have those persuasive techniques. If it's more to entertain, then naturally you're going to have some more creative writing techniques in there. So this is really, really key for question 4, just coming back to this original slide. So yes, we've just looked at some of these areas in a little bit more detail, and those are things which you don't necessarily have to write down. You don't have to kind of scribble the answers to all of those different things in your planning section. It's kind of a mental process that you'll go through to try to understand and tap into the writer's intentions with their source as much as you possibly can. Because the more implicit you are with your understanding and the more subtle you are with your understanding of those sources, the more chance you've got of achieving higher marks with this question. Okay, let's have a look at this question itself then. So, for this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with source B, the father's letter to a family friend. Compare how the two writers convey their different attitudes to parenting and education. In your answer, you could compare their different attitudes, compare the methods they use to convey their attitudes, support your ideas with references to both texts. So if you do pause the video now, as you have done on previous videos, and just consider, if you were in the exam, what are the key bits of that question? What would you actually highlight so that you could remember that those are important bits of information. So just pause the video now and consider that on your own. So hopefully you'll have come up with something similar. It's it's telling you that you can look at the whole of source A, which was there was only one part to that. This source material is quite odd really, because it's almost like you've got three sources, because source B is split into two sections, one letter from Henry and one letter from the father. But in this case you need to go really careful, because the question is just limiting you to the father's letter, so you wouldn't be able to bring in anything from Henry's letter that you've analysed in question 3. So just the father's letter in this case. I should probably have underlined compare if we need a little recap, is pointing out the similarities and all the differences. And then here comes our topic of our question topic: different attitudes to parenting and education. Again, a bit of an odd question, because it's almost like there's two topics within this. So in a second we'll see how you might break that down and deal with those separately. As always, whenever you see these bullet points in your attached to your question, do take note of them. The exam board are trying to be nice and give you some helpful hints and sort of steer you in the right direction. Okay, so we know that the question topic is on parenting and education. Now, ideally, in an ideal world, and remember that once you've planned, you're only going to have approximately 15 minutes to write this answer. But in an ideal world, we would want to achieve about 4 PEA paragraphs. So, just as kind of basic diagram for what that's going to look like, you're going to go for 1 paragraph on source A's viewpoint on parenting and education. You are going to pinpoint whether that's similar or different to source B by using a discourse marker, and then you're going to talk about source B's viewpoint on parenting and education, and then you're going to repeat that process, and that's pretty much going to be the structure of your answer. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and to have a read through both of the sources that you've been directed to by the question, and just ask yourself, okay, what is source A, what's Eddie's father's view of parenting and education compared with Henry's father's view of parenting and education. Try to identify some quotes, because you're going to need to put those into your answer, and also try to find a couple of possibilities of different methods that actually tell you that that is what the father's viewpoint is. So think about those language techniques, structural techniques, and also the use of tone to really help you to support why you think that the father has got that viewpoint on parenting and education. You'll see in the next slide that I've actually split up parenting and education into 2 separate categories, and you might like to do the same if it makes it easier for you. So do pause the video now and see what you can come up with by yourself. Okay, so as I said before, I've broken this down into separate education and separate parenting comments. Now, as always, this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, there was so much that you could have commented on in this question, but I've only just gone for 2 examples of each, just to give you a bit of an idea. So, source A, I have said that Eddie's father's viewpoint on education is that he almost seems to be quite intimidated by it, and we can sort of tell this from that jokey conversational tone that he has throughout his article, and the fact that he likes to use humour. He makes jokes about his grades lining up like a line of Pac-Men doing a conga, and we almost get the sense that he's trying to cover up his discomfort really, and the fact that he does feel a little bit intimidated by the education system and the fact that he struggles with it. On the other hand, I don't know about you, but I got the sense that the father from source B, so Henry's father, he wasn't necessarily intimidated by education. In fact, he almost seemed himself to have a good education, and perhaps therefore we could infer that he would want the same for his kids. So that was suggested to me by the fact that he's got quite a formal tone, and he uses quite sophisticated vocabulary as well. For instance, I also do not like the injunction laid upon them. So he's got a very sophisticated style of writing. Another point for education that you might have picked up on is that Eddie's father, he sees education as a bit of a chore, and something that he's really not very enthusiastic about. And I thought that we could tell that through the use of the verbs when he's talking about the food metaphor, and the fact that he had nothing to drag out and slap on the table. And I thought that those verbs created the impression of lethargy, so kind of having no energy for education, kind of having no enthusiasm for it. So we almost get the impression that he doesn't really see a lot of value in it. On the other hand, Henry's father in source B, he seems to be almost angry about the fact that his sons have made no improvement, and I picked up on that from the repetition of the phrase "do not." He says, I do not approve of the system of education, for they do not appear to have improved. So yeah, for me that created a bit of an angry tone. So he definitely seems to be an advocator of education. Okay, so let's move on to parenting then, and the differences in their opinions on parenting and their parenting styles. So for Eddie, I said that for Eddie's father, he seems to take a bit more of an involved approach with his son. It's almost like he goes out of his comfort zone. I mean, we definitely get the impression that he's not very comfortable with the homework that Eddie is given. But it's almost like he tries to sort of pull together with his son and show some solidarity. And he says just so that he can get a sense of what it's like to be the 14-year-old Eddie. So we always get the sense that he's kind of like he's quite together with Eddie. He's trying to help him and sort of understand, what he has to go through. So we get the sense he's quite involved with his son. On the other hand, for source B, Henry's father does seem quite detached from his sons. He seems to have a less personal relationship with them. So, I mean, we know from question 3 that Henry's letter was incredibly emotive, but the father, he doesn't immediately act on that. He investigates it further. So we almost get the sense that he's a bit doubtful. We get that sort of doubtful kind of sceptical tone, which kind of tells us that maybe he distrusts his son, or that, he doesn't really care about the fact that Henry's complaining and the fact that Henry's not very happy. Then another point that you could put forward about Eddie's father is that he seems quite relaxed and well-humoured with his son. I thought that he seemed less authoritative. He's kind of willing to accept the fact, quite readily accept the fact that his son is more intelligent than him and is better at all this schoolwork than he is. And I thought the fact that when he uses that rhetorical question of who needs teachers to humiliate you when your son can do it so effectively, it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, a bit sarcastic, but we get the sense that the father's kind of taking it all in his stride, and he's being quite good, quite well-humoured about it. So we get the sense that he's not really that authoritative. He doesn't seem to have that much of a problem with Eddie kind of having the upper hand on him in terms of intellect. With source B, on the other hand, the father does seem to be more authoritative, as the fact that he's writing the letter to Mr. Harmer in the first place almost shows that he won't allow his children, in particular Henry, to call the shots. It's almost like he needs to corroborate, he needs to check everything over first before he'll take it as fact. And also he kind of uses, as an embedded clause, he uses the adverb confidentially. So that kind of gives us an impression that he's going about it a bit secretly and a bit slyly, almost like he's checking up on Henry. So we definitely get the sense that he is a little bit more authoritative. Now, I've just realised that pretty much all of the points that I've raised there are differences. You may well have come up with some similarities between the fathers. It wasn't something that jumped out at me, but the whole idea of comparison is that you could pick out similarities or differences. It will just depend on the source that you've got in front of you and what you notice. Okay, so let's have a look then at how we would put those ideas together into a comparative paragraph. You're going to go for the PEA style again, the point evidence analyse style, just as you have done with all of the other questions. But as you'll see in a minute, because it's a comparison and you're going to have to bring two sources into the paragraph, you're going to have to go about it ever so slightly differently. But the general structure is a topic sentence to introduce the overall category of the upcoming comparison. So just outlining, what sort of thing you're going to be comparing. Then you need to put forward your point, so you need to offer a comment about source A's opinion on parenting and education. You need to back that up with a concise quote, and then in the analysis, that's where you really need to draw on all of your subject terminology to say how the writer has shown his viewpoint or his opinion with language, structure or tone. You need to consider the impact as always when it comes to the analyse section. You need to be thinking, okay, well, how does the language, structure or tone create this viewpoint, and how does it sort of influence me to think that is the writer's opinion? So really kind of get into the nitty-gritty if you can. Okay, let's have a look what that's going to look like then. You'll notice that there seems to be a whole range of colours on this page, and that is so that you can identify the different sections of this comparative paragraph. If you look at the colours in this section, and I'm circling with the mouse right now, those are going to be, that's your PEA paragraph related to source A, whereas these other colours are more to do with source B. So you can pause the video now and you can have a little look through that paragraph and see how you might be able to piece together the viewpoint on source A, so on Eddie's father, and then the viewpoint from source B with Henry's father. Do take note of where the colours change so that you can kind of keep track of which stage you're at. So do pause that video now and please do read that extract to give you a bit of an idea of how to put the paragraph together. Okay, so let's have a reminder of this question 4 process then. Firstly, you're going to need to, as always, underline the keywords within the question. So highlight the key bits so that you can stay on task with exactly what they've asked you to do. Number 2, perhaps the most important bit, you need to establish the viewpoint that the writers have on the topic. I mean, by the time you get to question 4, you're probably going to have quite a strong sense of the viewpoint because you'll have been working with the sources, right from the start, from all the way through the other questions. So your viewpoint on the sources and on the topic, might be quite strong by that point, hopefully. Then you need to take some time out of that 20 minutes, anything up to 5 minutes worth of time, to do some planning, where you're going to aim to plan 4 points, preferably 2 on each source, that suggest a viewpoint of the writer. So you've got to be sure to back that up with writer's methods and also quotes to make sure that you've got a completely sufficient answer. And then finally, you're going to aim to write 4 comparative PEA paragraphs where you're going to compare the viewpoint of source A against the viewpoint of source B. Some things to watch out for in this question. You need to aim to draw on the implicit information. So if you're after decent marks, you need to kind of go for the subtle differences or similarities. Don't just go for the obvious ones that the examiner's going to have heard before. Go for that kind of under the surface, more implicit details to get you further up that mark scheme. You're also going to need to support all of the points that you make with concise and accurate quotes. And then finally, you're also going to need to use your subject terminology to really hit that requirement to talk about writer's methods. So really draw on all of the subject terminology that you know, to talk about language, tone and also structure. And that is everything for question 4.